Welcome to season 2, episode 2 of Beyond Labels. Thank you so much for tuning in. Today's episode is probably going to become one of your favorite topics by the end of this episode because this one completely changed the way I look at human behavior. And honestly, it's written to change the way most people think about themselves. The word is ego. Now, usually, when people hear that word, they immediately think arrogance, self importance, selfishness, narcissism, someone obsessed with themselves. But the deeper I got into psychology, trauma research, attachment theory, nervous system regulation, and Eastern philosophy, the harder it became to see ego as arrogance alone. I started seeing it way differently, almost like a psychological armor, a protective system. And once that clicked for me, a lot of human behavior suddenly started making more sense. Why people become controlling under stress, why some people shut down emotionally, why some constantly need reassurance, why others become addicted to validation, why some over explain, over perform, people please, withdraw. Underneath many of those behaviors, there's often a nervous system trying to maintain stability, not necessarily a person consciously trying to become harmful. That's a different scenario. Now, obviously, harmful behavior is still an harmful behavior, and accountability matters there. There are laws and regulations. But understanding why the system behaves the way it does gives us a much more intelligent framework than simply labeling people and moving on. And honestly, I think modern psychological conversations online completely miss this. Everything becomes a label, everybody becomes a category. But human beings are far more state dependent than people realize. A person operating from regulation can look completely different from the same person operating from stress, fear, shame, abandonment, exhaustion, or nervous system overload. And that's one of the central ideas behind this paper that you can read on my academia profile. I'll post the link in the description of this podcast. The paper actually explains why ego is not a fixed personality and why it's a regulatory system. One thing I noticed while I researched this is that people often think psychological patterns begin in adulthood. But after exploring developmental psychology, especially through the lens of Daniel Stern's interpersonal world of the infant, I started realizing many of these adaptations begin very early. Childhood environments matter more than people realize. If emotional expression gets punished, the subconscious adapts. If love feels conditional, the body adapts. If unpredictability dominates the environment, the nervous system adapts. And over time, those adaptations become automatic. And that's the important part, automatic. Not always conscious, not always intentional, automatic. A child who learns, I need approval to stay connected, may grow into an adult who constantly people pleases without fully understanding why. Another child may learn, vulnerability leads to disappointment. So later in life, they become emotionally distant, hyper independent, or overly controlling. Not because they consciously decided to disconnect from people, but because somewhere along the way, the nervous system learned distance feels safer than disappointment. And that's a very different lens. Now, in the paper, I discuss different ego functions, ego configurations, not personality disorders, not fixed identities, protective ego configurations, ways the nervous system organizes itself under stress. One of them is what I call the mask of compliance. These are people who regulate themselves through approval, perfectionism, functionality, and keeping the peace. Externally, they may look calm and highly functional, but internally, they may be suppressing massive amounts of emotional tension. Another configuration is regulation through attachment. These are people whose nervous system stabilizes through reassurance, closeness, validation, emotional intensity. Relationships almost become emotional oxygen. Then there's the opposite side, the defensive withdrawers, the people who protect themselves through distance, emotional shutdown, cynicism, control, or detachment. And what's fascinating is many people oscillate between these states depending on stress levels. Someone can appear emotionally warm and available 1 month and suddenly become cold and unreachable during overwhelm. Again, state dependence, not fixed identity. And honestly, one of the most important parts of this entire paper is the section on collapse. Because I genuinely think modern society is witnessing large scale psychological exhaustion in real time. People are overwhelmed, attention spans are collapsing, overstimulation is everywhere, economic pressure, identity confusion, relationship instability, constant notifications, political outrage, algorithmic manipulation, emotional burnout, and millions of people are reaching their limit. Sometimes people are not becoming worse. The nervous system compensating for unresolved instability is simply failing in real time. The person can no longer hold themselves together the way they used to. And people often misinterpret that collapse morally. But many times, the protective structure holding everything together just runs out of regulatory capacity. And suddenly, all the unresolved chaos underneath begins surfacing as fear, grief, anger, shame, confusion, abandonment. Not because the person is weak, not because the person became weak, but because the nervous system became exhausted. And this also explains why insight alone often fails to change people. People assume if someone understands their behavior intellectually, they should automatically change. But merely information doesn't change you. Your nervous system has to be internally regulated for you to have any kind of change in your life. Because insight is not the same as regulation. A person can fully understand their trauma intellectually and still become reactive when emotionally triggered. Because when the nervous system enters threat mode, reflective thinking starts shutting down. The brain shifts towards survival. That's the reason why confrontation often backfires. That's why shame rarely heals people. That's why screaming accountability at dysregulated nervous systems often increases defensiveness instead of producing integration. The system protects itself first. That's what it was designed to do. And honestly, I think this is where some modern spiritual conversations also become dangerous. Because there's this obsession now with kill the ego, destroy the ego, dissolve the ego. But if fundamentally ego is protective, then trying to forcibly dismantle it before safety exists can destabilize people even further. The nervous system interprets it as threat. So instead of softening, the ego hardens, which is why people become more reactive after criticism, more rigid after confrontation, more dissociated after extreme spiritual practices pursued without grounding. And eventually, this leads to probably the most important conclusion of the paper. The goal is not ego eradication, the goal is integration. Healthy people still have ego. The difference is flexibility. A healthy ego can tolerate uncertainty, reflection, accountability, complexity, emotional nuance. A rigid ego cannot. And when regulation improves, something interesting starts happening naturally. The system softens, the defensiveness decreases, the awareness increases, empathy becomes more accessible, and what many traditions call the true self becomes easier to access. Not because the person became spiritually superior, but because the nervous system no longer has to spend all its energy defending itself constantly. Healing is not becoming somebody else, it's becoming regulated enough to stop living entirely in survival mode. And honestly, if there's one sentence from this entire paper I hope people remember, it's this: the ego is not the enemy, dysregulation is. I genuinely think that sentence explains a huge percentage of modern human conflict. In relationships, politics, leadership, families, shows, social media, even institutions. So many systems today are operating from threat based regulation without even realizing it. And until people begin understanding the relationship between nervous system regulation, identity protection, stress, and human behavior, we are going to keep moralizing survival responses instead of understanding them. It's not going to change. It's a vicious cycle and it keeps continuing until the lack of awareness is mitigated completely, which is what I'm trying to attempt here. And it's a very hard thing to do, but someone has to start. Someone has to access the deeper layers of the mind to figure out what the hell is going on in this world. And again, understanding does not actually remove accountability. We are trying to create precision here. And in 2026, precision matters more than ever before. As we can see the illusion of control continuing to crack down in real time across modern society. If humanity genuinely wants to heal, instead of endlessly reacting to symptoms, then maybe it's finally time to start understanding ourselves more deeply instead of pointing fingers elsewhere all the time. Take your time with this one. Thanks for being here. This is Beyond Labels. I'll see you in the next episode. Thank you.